Well, good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be in the world joining this, an Asia Society Policy Institute live broadcast on Taiwan. The events which have brought us all to the edge of our seats in the last week or so with Speaker Pelosi's visit, the Chinese reaction to it, and what will be the American reaction to the events that we have seen. And in overall terms, where does this leave us in terms of the strategic stability in the relationship between the United States and China, and specifically the future stability of Taiwan itself? And I'm very pleased to say that in advancing this conversation, we have brought together a great panel. And I'm going to turn to our Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Rorry, to do the introductions. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Kevin, for welcoming us and for getting started. Although I think the events of the last 10 days have been dramatic, I think it's also important to remember that what is happening now is really symptomatic of trends that have been taking place since long before Nancy Pelosi set foot in Taipei. Of course, Beijing has long bristled at what it sees as upgrades in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And this is all happening in an environment of very poor communication. There's been no official communication, actually, between Beijing and Taipei for many years, and the relationship between the U.S. and China has vastly deteriorated over the past 6 years. So in order to kind of unpack how we got here and where we're going, we have this terrific group of panelists that I'm excited to introduce. Of course, we have Kevin Rudd. Kevin is the president and CEO of the Asia Society and the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. He served as 26th Prime Minister of Australia and is a scholar of Chinese politics, history, and of Xi Jinping's worldview. He's also author of several books, most recently, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of Catastrophic Conflict Between the U.S. and Xi Jinping's China. Also with us tonight, we have Bonnie Glaser. Bonnie is the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute and senior associate with the Pacific Forum. We're super delighted to have Bonnie here today. Bonnie is one of the U.S.'s foremost experts on cross-strait relations and on U.S.-China relations. She's widely published. I commend to you her recent op-ed in the New York Times, published just a couple weeks ago on the potential fallout of the Pelosi visit. Also joining us tonight, we have Danny Russel. Danny is the Vice President of International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He also has a distinguished career in government service, serving most recently as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. And last but not least, we have with us Orville Schell. Orville is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center of U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York. He's formerly the Dean of the Berkeley School of Journalism at the University of California and is himself the author of a staggering 15 books, of which 10 are on China. So welcome to the entire panel. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this night on a very timely subject. And I'd love to just dive right in. So Bonnie, I'm going to direct the first question to you. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how you summarize the Chinese response to the Pelosi visit so far. Of course, in addition to the punitive measures on Taiwan, the simulated military blockade, lots of different types of sanctions and restrictions on economic activity, the Chinese government has also released just this week a white paper on its Taiwan strategy and policy. I'd love to hear from you how the content of that document fits into the overall response to the Pelosi visit. The military activities may be, intended to warn of danger of upgrading the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, but does the document itself signal changes in China's long-term strategy for unification? And do you think that part of the content of that document was released in response to this visit? So Bonnie, over to you with just an incredibly easy question to start us out.
Well, a fantastic set of questions, Rorry, and thanks to you and Kevin and the Asia Society for convening us all today to talk about current developments in U.S.-China Taiwan relations in the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit. Beijing's response has been multidimensional and is intended to send deterrence signals as well as increase the PLA's preparedness for achieving unification by force if the party makes a decision to do so. Regarding the first objective, Beijing has for many months been telling the Biden administration that the U.S. one China policy is being hollowed out or salami sliced. They use both of those terms. In other words, it is losing credibility in the eyes of the Chinese. I believe that Xi Jinping does not want a war with the United States, and he doesn't want to have his options narrowed. And he doesn't want great instability either in the China-Taiwan relationship or in the U.S.-China relationship in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress. Xi Jinping has told President Biden directly that there is a gap between U.S. declaratory policy and U.S. actions toward Taiwan. So I believe in taking the set of measures, the military actions, the economic coercion, punitive actions against Taiwan, that China is essentially trying to shore up its red lines and signal resolve. Of course, the party is also demonstrating to its own people that it is determined to defend Chinese sovereignty and territorial integrity. Regarding the second objective, China's military responses were quite robust. The PLA rehearsed a blockade around Taiwan for the first time. And in an unprecedented step, they fired missiles, 4 missiles over Taiwan for the first time. So they also operated very, very large numbers of aircraft, Navy ships in the Taiwan Strait. PLA experts went on social media. They told the world that the closure zones around Taiwan were intended to show that China can shut down traffic in and out of Taiwan's main ports, block the waterway through the Bashi Strait, and prevent foreign forces from flowing to Taiwan from Okinawa. The PLA used this opportunity to practice its joint operations capability. I'm sure for the United States and for Japan in particular, this was likely an intelligence bonanza. We will learn a lot about the PLA, its strengths and its deficiencies from what we have collected. But of course, the PLA will also learn and it will improve its capabilities as a result. Moreover, China will not let a good crisis go to waste. Just as it did in the East China Sea in 2012 and the South China Sea shortly thereafter, China is doing its utmost to change the status quo in its favor now in the Taiwan Strait. Going forward, I think it will essentially erase the median line by regularly operating aircraft and ships over that line. Of course, a few years ago, the Chinese already stated publicly that they do not recognize this line, but, they tacitly recognized it for 20 years between the late 1990s and more recently. But in March of 2019, they crossed the Taiwan Strait with aircraft, but they haven't been operating regularly. And I think they will be doing so going forward. The PLA has also left itself some room to further escalate going forward if the United States and Taiwan do not heed China's warnings. So, for example, it did not fly or sail within the 12 nautical mile territorial air or sea space. Finally, let me just say something about the white paper. We could probably have a whole session on that. It was the first one that was released in 22 years on Taiwan. According to my sources, the white paper was completed a few months ago. It was put on the shelf, and the crisis provided a perfect time to roll it out, to reinforce Beijing's messaging. I expect that they would have rolled it out sometime before the 20th Party Congress, but this was an opportunity. And this is essentially part of China's efforts to shape the narrative about its unquestionable sovereignty. And the world's acceptance of the One China principle is central in this white paper. The ways in which the one country, two systems might be applied to Taiwan going forward is also an interesting piece in the white paper, because Xi Jinping, in his January 2019 speech, raised the idea of a new one country, two systems plan for Taiwan. And last fall, in the third historical resolution, there was reference to a comprehensive plan for resolving the Taiwan issue. So we are seeing, I think, in this white paper, some of the preview of what the party is thinking about the answers to this question, what a one country, two systems version or plan for Taiwan looks like. But I will close by saying that a lot of people are comparing this white paper to the last one in 2000. Now, of course, there's been a great deal that has happened since then. It is obviously correct to highlight that in the 2000 paper, the Chinese said that Taiwan could keep its military as part of a one country, two systems plan, and that this is not mentioned in the 22 version. But I will also remind our listeners that Xi Jinping himself, in his comprehensive speech on January 2nd, 2019, also did not reference that Taiwan would be able to keep its military. So we have to look not only at that last white paper in 2000, is my point, but we have to look at the other statements, the authoritative statements, and particularly the speeches by Xi Jinping that have been made that show the evolution of the approach to Taiwan. And next, we will look toward the Party Congress and see what else comes out there. And of course, beyond that, to the National People's Congress, and whether there might be new laws passed, such as a national reunification law concerning Taiwan. So I hope I've given you all a lot to chew on, and I look forward to hearing the views of my fellow panelists.
Thanks for that, Bonnie. That was an incredibly useful and comprehensive look at where we are today. And I really appreciated that you referenced this kind of stepwise movement toward a Xi Jinping era policy on Taiwan. Some other things that you brought up that I thought were useful to start unpacking in this discussion are, of course, there is a U.S. One China policy. There is also China's One China principle. And those two things are separate and not equal, right? There's China's One China principle says there is but one China in the world, and Taiwan is a part of China. The U.S. One China policy, on the other hand, says that the U.S. doesn't take a position on whether or not Taiwan is a part of China, but would like to see this issue resolved in accordance with the wishes of the people of Taiwan and without the use of force or coercion. So another thing that I think has changed in the last 20 years since the last white paper on Taiwan was released is that the balance of military power has shifted so overwhelmingly in favor of Beijing, and not just military power, but also economic power, political power, that is becoming less compatible for the U.S. to hold a policy, a one China policy that says, on one hand, we would like to see this issue, resolved accordance of the wishes of the people of Taiwan and without the use of force or coercion. So to kind of keep unpacking how the U.S. is seeing China's moves, I'd like to turn to Danny. Bonnie described the Chinese response as shoring up China's red lines and signaling resolve. Do you think that that is how the U.S. is seeing it? There have been statements from U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Blinken, saying that China is overreacting to this visit. And I think both sides have accused the other of disrupting the cross-strait status quo and of making this problem worse and of escalating the situation. So can you kind of help us these dueling narratives. What does China expect of the U.S. and what does the U.S. expect of China?
Oh, thanks, Rorry. Well, what each of the capitals expect and what they are, in fact, trying to obtain, what they're shooting for, I think, are two different things. Expectations are pretty low on both sides. I would describe this as really a battle over the narrative high ground, or putting it another way, this is the blame game. My impression is, from talking to friends in Asia, that initially many audiences in Asia thought that it was kind of the Americans who started it, that a visit now in this very fraught environment when bilateral relations are so tense between Washington and Beijing, when China is enmeshed in this big domestic political process that's super sensitive, that a visit by the Speaker of the House to Taiwan, which after all is only the second time in 40 years, probably not wise. And I think, the pot shot that President Biden took in front of the camera saying, well, the U.S. military doesn't think it's a good idea, that may have reinforced that perception that the Pelosi visit was an unnecessary provocation. Although I will say that there's probably not a country in Asia who wasn't relieved that the United States didn't back down in the face of Beijing's public threats. But it's been the duration and the intensity and the really bellicose character, I think, of the Chinese response that has swung the needle of broad opinion, as I can ascertain, in Asia. And now it's the Chinese side who appears to be the ones undermining regional stability. And a big part of American diplomacy in the aftermath and against the background of all these exercises is shining a spotlight on that and encouraging other countries to speak out against Chinese bellicose behavior. You see some national statements. Obviously, we saw the G7 statements. That kind of thing may not have a whole lot of impact on Beijing. Now, I myself have negotiated a lot of statements with the ASEAN since not fun. And I personally read the ASEAN foreign minister statement as a distinct signal that they feel that the Chinese have been overreacting. And when you take a step back and look at it, Rorry, I mean, really, an 82-year-old grandmother visits Taiwan for 18 hours and says nothing new? I don't mean to trivialize it. She is the Speaker of the House, but in response, China is launching day after day after day of fighter plane sorties, of live fire exercises, ballistic missiles, cyber attacks, destroyers, blood-curdling rhetoric. Some of this, I'm sure, is the wolf warrior approach. It plays well to the home audience, and that's more important maybe than achieving the desired effect overseas, particularly due to the fact that a lot of Chinese netizens sort of ridiculed the initial PLA, the initial military response. But I think there are other things at work. Bonnie, importantly and correctly, observed that Xi Jinping is not one to let a good crisis go to waste, and he's ensuring that the PLA can conduct exercises they wouldn't be able to do in normal circumstances. It's clearly very important to punish the Taiwanese, to intimidate the Japanese, to send a warning to Washington. But I'd say, frankly, that the bottom line for me is that what we're seeing in this kind of battle for the narrative increasingly reminds me of the sort of recruitment of third countries and the potential for creating blocks or axes, the sort of international landscape that I think those of us who lived through the US-Soviet Cold War hoped that we would never see again. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that, Danny. It reminds me that, Taiwan is not a passive player in this drama either. And of course, Taiwan's Foreign Minister, Joseph Wu, held a press conference this week where he called attention to how the actions and perhaps the overreaction of China, particularly through these military activities, signals China's intention in the entire region and could be a threat not just to Taiwan, but really to a lot of allies and partners that the U.S. has and neighbors of China all the way through Southeast Asia. So on that point, Orville, I'd love to turn to you. You know, there's a signal that Beijing is sending about the seriousness of this visit, how it sees upgrades in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, you know, whether that is an overreaction or not, or being perceived as an overreaction in the U.S., we should probably not lose sight of how it's being perceived in Taiwan. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about the conversation in Taiwan domestic politics, about its relations with the PRC. You know, how is the message that Beijing is trying to send through all of these punitive measures, how is that being perceived in Taiwan today?
Well, thanks, Rorry. It's nice to be on with you, Danny, and Bonnie and Kevin. I think the thing it's surprising to me is the way in which, if hearts and minds, remember the old question of winning the hearts and minds of the people, has any currency in China, I think it would be hard to find. China's policies, which have been so obstreperous and bellicose, have really diminished any prospect of winning the hearts and minds of people in Taiwan to willingly want to join. And remember, that was the promise for many, many years. It indeed was the promise of engagement. We stay engaged, things will converge more and more, and eventually, possibly, the Taiwan populace will find it in their interest to join China. China will become more open, and there'll be a natural kind of a reunification. Xi Jinping has really put a stake through the heart of that dream. And indeed, his dream, what's so alarming about it, and I think makes it so difficult for American diplomacy, is that what he has in essence done is internationalized his dream for China rejuvenation, not only to include what they have accomplished quite remarkably, namely the Chinese economic miracle, but he's also now irrevocably linked up success for that dream to a certain amount of international hegemony, particularly over Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and God knows what else. And so he has sort of painted himself into a position where the only option really is force and control. Because what is it, 1-point-something% of Taiwanese now think that reunification is a good idea. So he's really lost that game, which doesn't mean he won't and can't win. It only means the terms on which that happens must be coercive. And there's not a scintilla of evidence left that the feelings of the Taiwanese people will be respected or factored into the equation, never mind the quaint fact that one of the most vaunted principles of the United Nations is self-determination, and you have Quebec voting to leave Canada and Scotland voting to leave the UK, Czechoslovakia splitting up. No, none of that is possible in the Taiwan Straits. So we're left with, I'm afraid, some very unlikely, some unwelcome prospects that sooner or later, the only way Xi Jinping's dream, internationalized dream, can come to full term is by some sort of a forcible, a coerced reunification with Taiwan. And that leaves diplomats basically with very few cards to play, because I think in Xi Jinping's world, sadly, any kind of compromise, give a little to get a little, is viewed as so irrevocably a form of weakness that it doesn't fit into his notion of China as having been reborn, strong, and hegemonic, and not needing to heed or yield to any other forces around him. And that puts China and the US, I think, on a very dangerous collision course.
Well, to unpack that collision course, I'm going to definitely turn to Kevin Rudd in a second. I think that this is a topic on which he will have a lot to say. But although it's true that there are very few people in Taiwan that would choose unification as an ultimate goal. I think the majority of the people still do want to protect the status quo as they see it, which is basically, no independence, the three no's: no independence, no unification, no use of force. So I think the people of Taiwan are also left in a bit of a limbo where all of the trends are headed toward, as you said, force or coercion, but Taiwan would like to protect its autonomy and also to do so in a non-confrontational and non-conflictual way. So that is the knot that I turn to Kevin Rudd to untie. Kevin, how have broader trends kind of affected Xi Jinping's thinking on Taiwan strategy? Do you think that there is a timeline for unification? And what factors might influence Beijing's calculus in the coming years?
I think in response to that question, Rorry, that we're brought back to a fundamental question about Xi Jinping's strategy and ideology. I define that as an ideology of Marxist nationalism. And I think for both those reasons, it reinforces China's predisposition to move towards retaking Taiwan sometime between now and 2049. For Marxist reasons, it's the completion of the 49 revolution. That is, it's the missing bit. For nationalist reasons, of course, it's the bit of the country which China lost with the war with Japan in 1895, and really since then has not effectively regained sovereignty over. And both these things come together in Xi Jinping's vision for the, quote, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So therefore, those personal, political, ideological factors, I think, drive the system in this direction. None of the decisions that we've seen in the last week would have occurred militarily or diplomatically without the personal imprimatur of Xi Jinping. Although underpinning that, the system for quite some time has been preparing itself in these directions. On the second point that you raised, which is specifically about timetables, number one, I agree wholeheartedly with Bonnie's early remarks that Xi Jinping is not looking for an immediate war with the United States. That is the last thing on his preferred agenda. Nor do I think the United States is looking for a war with China over Taiwan, not just in the immediate future, but for the longer-term future as well. So therefore, when we see a lot of excited commentary around the international community at present that add Russia and Ukraine back in February to the saber rattling over the Taiwan Straits, the missile firings and the unprecedented nature of the military activity over Taiwan, add A plus B, we get to C, which is fasten our seatbelts for an impending major military action against Taiwan, tantamount to an invasion or something not far short of it sometime soon. I don't think the evidence stacks up in that direction at all. I'm interested to see what my colleagues have to say about me stating that so boldly. Secondly, what we do know has materially changed, however, is, and where Xi Jinping has changed Chinese doctrine to that of his predecessors, is by inserting for the first time in recent years the 2049 deadline for reunification with Taiwan. The reason we say that is because Xi Jinping has made clear that his nationalist vision of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation cannot be achieved in the absence of Taiwan. So for the first time in history, we have now a defined doctrinal statement from China's paramount leader that we're on a 27-year countdown. When within that 27 years is a separate question, but he has put it within his historical time rather than abstract time. And that, I think, is an important factor for all of us to focus on. These are not theoretical abstractions on the one hand, nor are they, in my judgment, immediate crisis in terms of a full-scale invasion in the immediate period ahead. So that brings us back to the third possibility, which is, so if not next month or next year, and if not 2049 itself, then what are we looking at in the medium term? The reason I have constantly said, by way of judgment in the international commentary on this, that I am more concerned about the late 20s and early 30s is because if you trace the internal ideological narrative of the Chinese Communist Party, it increasingly points to the correlation of forces, or China's notion of comprehensive national power, moving more and more in its own direction as time rolls by. Secondly, we have, of course, the Xi Jinping statement that China's military modernization should be completed by 2027. And thirdly, you see the moves in China's financial community and its financial regulators to begin to make China more robust in the future against the imposition of international dollar-denominated sanctions against the Chinese economy, against a possible invasion of Taiwan. I put all those evidence points together, and the final one being the most critical is that Xi Jinping intends to be around in the late 20s and the early 30s. And my own judgment is intends to be there until quite a long period of time. And I've argued probably until 2037, 3 Congresses from now, which would only make him a sprightly 84 years old. But for those sorts of reasons, I'm much more concerned about him, therefore, thinking that the opportunity would arise late 20s, early 30s, and certainly on his watch, because if you read his ideological literature, he's a person of enormous political and ideological ambition and wants to enter the Maoist pantheon as the person who did it. Finally, however, I'd say in the unravelling of what will be this double-pronged approach in the years ahead, pushing the military fist and pushing the diplomatic hand, as Bonnie eloquently pointed out at the beginning of our conversation this evening, a further adjustment of circumstances on the ground through a series of military actions, the incremental erosion of the medium line, the Taiwan Strait itself turning into a Chinese lake over time, reinforcing the fact that through these repeated actions, through missile attacks, that China is capable of effecting a blockade, that these things begin to become more, shall we say, normative over time. And at the same time, you'll see unfolded this parallel diplomatic strategy of which the Taiwan White Paper is, I think, the first of many installments. Whether one country, 2 systems or one country, 3 systems actually has any further appeal to the Chinese people in the future, I'm as sceptical as the rest of the participants, I think. But I think we're going to see both these things unleashed simultaneously. But I think this is with a view to a strategy running for the next several years and possibly into the early 2030s, rather than reaching a cataclysmic conclusion in the next 12 months, barring, of course, a completely out of left field incident which escapes escalation management control. But I'll leave that caveat at the end. Back to you, Rorry.
Okay, thank you very much. So what I'm hearing from all of the panelists is that there's a foreboding and formidable Chinese plan to take Taiwan at almost any cost at some point in the future. But of course, China is not the only actor in this puzzle or on this globe. There are, I think, and I think the white paper actually speaks to, the U.S. as an external force that is trying to thwart these grand ambitions that China has for national rejuvenation. So I would like to talk a little bit about moves that the U.S. is making in order to forestall this eventuality. And maybe later in this discussion, we could also talk about one country, 2 systems and its appeal, particularly after Hong Kong. So the reference to one country, 3 systems, meaning that there's already been an instance of one country, 2 systems in Hong Kong that did not appeal to the people of Hong Kong or especially to the people of Taiwan. But let's start with the U.S. and what it can do. So Taiwan policy in the United States is managed by the president and his officials in the executive branch, but it's also shaped by Congress. And Congress has had a number of bills over the last several years dealing with the issue of Taiwan. It's been involved in the Taiwan issue since the normalization of relations of the U.S. and the People's Republic of China by passing the Taiwan Relations Act, by carving out kind of a special relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan that Congress sees itself as the steward of. So Bonnie, I'd like to turn to you. How do you see the role of Congress in cross-Taiwan Strait relations at the moment? And where do you see it going in the coming years as the U.S. tries to kind of mount a response sufficient to preventing the PRC from overwhelming Taiwan by use of force or coercion?
Well, Rorry, there is certainly very strong bipartisan support in Congress for Taiwan. We saw this when Speaker Pelosi said that she was going to go to Taiwan, and she got an enormous amount of backing, not only many in her own party, but particularly from the Republicans. We have seen an unprecedented number of bills that have been tabled in Congress, very few of which have passed. But I have to say that in my conversations with various Chinese scholars in recent days, what I've been hearing is that they see that our domestic politics in the United States has seeped into our foreign policy in ways that is very troubling to them. They are quite concerned that the executive branch cannot manage the proactive efforts that are being taken by Congress, which they see as, again, undermining the One China policy. You've asked to sort of look out over the next few years, but I have to say that I think what is most important is what will happen in the next few months. The Taiwan Policy Act, which was supposed to be marked up on August 3rd, the day that Nancy Pelosi was in Taiwan, markup was postponed until September because the Senate had to finalize the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And so that's been postponed. But it is really important to look at what is in that act. And I think that the Biden administration itself is concerned that there are some provisions in it that probably will not meaningfully contribute to Taiwan's security. They may provide some symbolic support, but perhaps at a great cost. And a few of those are the possible renaming of the Taiwan Representative Office in Washington to the Taiwan Representative Office from its current name of the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Representative Office, the designation of Taiwan formally as a non-NATO ally, enabling Taiwanese military officers to wear their uniforms, and a few key provisions to bolster Taiwan's defense, which really do have strong bipartisan support and support within the executive branch to provide foreign military financing to Taiwan. So this is, U.S. taxpayers' dollars going to help strengthen Taiwan's military in ways that we have not done in the past. So I think that China itself is very concerned about the role of Congress. They started becoming very alarmed when we passed the Taiwan Travel Act. And indeed, I've heard some Chinese experts in recent days say, Nancy Pelosi's visit is an evidence of the implementation of the Taiwan Travel Act. Well, to me, that's just evidence that the Chinese still don't understand the role of Congress, because she didn't need the Taiwan Travel Act to go to Taiwan. But there's, I believe, knowledge in China among those who study the United States that we do have three co-equal branches of government. Our president cannot tell a member of Congress what to do. And for those who understand that, I think it actually makes them more anxious. It means, as I said, that the executive branch can't completely control foreign policy. So there's concern about the push from Congress for supporting and emboldening, as they would say, Taiwan independence. So I think we're in for some just a rocky road ahead, even in this short-term period. And I'll leave it to others to talk about the longer term.
Thanks, Bonnie. I really appreciate those remarks, and especially highlighting the Taiwan Policy Act. I did have somebody, a well-respected Chinese scholar, tell me several years ago that the biggest challenge for China in the next 10 or 15 years is dealing with a divided America. And I think that there are probably challenges that go beyond just bipartisan support for Taiwan, but also have to do with the Biden administration's strong pushback against authoritarianism, which of course makes Taiwan an attractive partner, but also I think a very strong anti-CCP agenda in the Republican Party. We've seen former high-ranking officials from the Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, former Defense Secretary Esper, go to Taiwan as well in the last 6 months and express, disdain for treating Taiwan as an unofficial partner, saying that, the U.S. should just go ahead and admit the fact that Taiwan is its own entity, own country, without Taiwan needing to declare independence, which of course could trigger China's use of force without Taiwan actually having to do anything at all. Danny, I want to turn to you to unpack some of this. You worked in the executive branch, you worked with Congress, you have an understanding of some of the personalities at play here. How do you think China will deal with a divided America in the years to come? There's a chance that the Trump administration or that President Trump himself might come back and be in power in 2024. How is that affecting China's calculus on working with the United States and on dealing with the cross-Taiwan Strait relations?
That's a tough question, Rorry. I think that it's in the nature of humans, and certainly in the nature of the Chinese leadership, to see the world through the lens of their own political system. And in large part means that they just don't believe that there are three co-equal branches of government. They've read it, they've seen it on pieces of paper, but they know better because they're students of power. And their experience has convinced them that the power holders can shape events. These things don't happen by accident. So, I think that when scholars in China talk about a divided America, they're talking about an extreme political polarization, not any sort of constitutional division. I'm prejudiced. I'm probably a bad person to answer this question because as a career executive branch person, my perspective is that it is rarely a good thing when Congress is the activist party on foreign policy issues. First, because I think principally it's in the purview of the executive branch to set foreign policy, and that congressional activism is usually a signal that Congress is dissatisfied and is underwhelmed by the administration's handling of issues. Second, because legislating foreign policy, Kevin can tell you, is a pretty clumsy business. It usually politicizes issues. It carries a lot of unintended consequences. It can really tie the hands of the people that have to implement policy, carry out negotiations, and so on. When the executive and the legislative branches are collaborating, that's a very different story. That you'll get a lot better outcomes there. But certainly, I think the Chinese perspective on the divided United States is that the correlation of forces is playing out as predicted. That the imperialist capitalist system is, swallowing its own tail, is collapsing under its own weight, and that China's moment is here. That's not a theory that goes very far in explaining the real estate crisis or the banking crisis or China's extraordinary unpopularity around the world. And so you get a lot of dissembling and you get a lot of scapegoating. But I think that there is still a strong sense in China that America is a declining power, a disintegrating power, and that China can and should stand up and claim its pride of place in international global governance system. And that, as Kevin has pointed out, means there's turbulence ahead.
Thanks for that, Danny. I fully appreciate your point that China sees the U.S. as a declining power, but there still seems to be quite a bit of anxiety in China about moves that the U.S. is making to decouple, let's say particularly in the tech sector. And this is an area where Taiwan has an important role to play in the supply chain. So Orville, I want to turn to you. Could you walk us through a little bit Taiwan's role in the global tech supply chain and how Taiwan's value in that chain might be affecting how all three capitals are viewing the risk in cross-Taiwan Strait relations?
Well, I think, one of the things that people don't adequately appreciate is the degree to which globalization not only bound the U.S. and China together in the marketplace, but the degree to which Taiwan itself is bound to China. China is its largest trading partner. And one of the key ways that it impacts just about everything that gets made in the world, that we are all insolubly bound together, is microprocessors. Now, it just so happens that when we were living in this glorious world, we didn't care where something was made. As long as it was made well, we could buy it and get it shipped quickly and didn't have to keep big inventories. We just let anyone do anything and bought from them. And in that period, it turns out that Taiwan became the most central place in the entire planet in terms of chips, so that 92% of the leading edge chips are made there and a large number of legacy chips as well. And so the question is, as we've learned in the Ukraine, it's all very well to say, well, we don't believe in decoupling and don't see how this is going to happen, and we certainly don't want to promote it. But we learn that sometimes push comes to shove. And they may have a time frame of 5 years, 4 years, 10 years before they do something, plan to do something precipitous in the Taiwan Straits, but stuff happens. And then what happens to these supply chains, particularly in the tech sector? What happens to TSMC, which makes them and also has a very robust market in China, as does Samsung, as does, for that matter, American companies like Qualcomm. So we are looking at the prospect, and we just don't know if this will happen, of the unraveling of the entire global fabric of the marketplace. And if we didn't believe it could happen before the Ukraine, it seems to me we ought to pay some attention that things do unravel. And then when they do, you're out of Russia and you lose everything. So I don't know what the answer is to it. I would also say, one thing I'd be curious to know what my colleagues think. The one China policy is all well and good, but actually it takes both sides to reciprocally make it viable. I wonder if America couldn't, in some sense, thrust some of the responsibility for maintaining it, not just canceling Pelosi's visit and getting on bended knee before Beijing, but to say to Beijing, you want a one China policy? We're there now. But we see this melting away underneath us. You have to work with us if this is going to be a viable pathway in the future. What would their response be?
That's a wonderful question, and I'd welcome thoughts from the panelists on it.
You're smiling, Danny. You must have an answer.
Danny,
I'll hear Danny's. Danny, you go first, then I'll add my bit.
You have a smile too, Kevin.
Well, because we've been on the receiving end of one too many bilateral engagement with Chinese leadership. Look, I think that the Chinese have firmly set the template here, which is that they need to back the United States off further. They need to cow and demoralize the Taiwans. They need to scare the bejesus out of the Japanese and others. And they ultimately will present to Taiwan and the world an offer they can't refuse. You can do it the easy way, you can do it the hard way. And I strongly suspect, unless the personnel changes in the aftermath of the 20th Party Congress are quite extraordinary, that the response we would get to your admonition, Orville, is just a formulaic reading of the catechism. Taiwan, it belongs to China, it's part of China, butt out, and mind your manners.
I think that would be my view as well, Orville. You would have a look of bemused non-comprehension on the part of our Chinese interlocutors, which would be along the Chinese equivalent of "Qu'est-ce qui se passe?" What the hell is this? This is什麼東西呢? So I'm not sure that will necessarily advance the state of our Taiwanese friends or US-China relations and their strategic stability. My overall thoughts on this are that for a moment we should try to imagine ourselves in Xi Jinping's shoes and how he views the events of the last 10 days. And then I'm going to make a few comments about what Bonnie raised before about the Taiwan Policy Act, because I think that's fundamentally important for the immediate period ahead. From Xi Jinping's perspective, I cannot help but conclude, leaving aside the filters which exist around him and the news that he receives and the advice that he's received in the political arrangements which have been put in place around the office of the General Secretary and the National President, which is largely about good news rather than other news. I nonetheless conclude that Xi Jinping, looking at the events of the last 10 days since the Pelosi visit, will say, that's pretty good. We have used a bunch of military measures. There was no military reaction from anybody. The Americans didn't react militarily. Taiwanese didn't react militarily. We lobbed 5 missiles into Japanese EEZ. There was no military reaction from Japan. There was a statement by 3 governments, the United States, Japan, and Australia, about it, largely triggered by, I think, by the overshoot into Japan, the deliberate overshoot into Japan, or the Japanese EEZ. What worries me, and not just in terms of militarily, as it were, changing circumstances on the ground, Bonnie's earlier point, which is where this takes us for the period ahead, but at a psychological and political level, their own internal conclusion that this has been a pretty successful operation. And I'm interested to hear contrary views, but I think it's important in our tempered analysis of this, we try to, as it were, war game this from the Chinese side to understand what their thinking is. That brings me to my second point, which is about the whole question of what then do we do? And I, a bit like Danny Russel, but as a former legislator myself, I'm always terrified when legislators take over foreign policy because it is by definition driven by interest from below. That is what the perception of the political constituency is, rather than the core disciplines of national security policy and foreign policy underpinning it. So when I look at the Taiwan Policy Act, I always ask myself this pretty simple question: what's going to enhance the security of the Taiwanese people and what isn't? What's going to enhance the parallel stability or instability of the US-China strategic relationship or undermine it? So let's leave the second of those off the table first and just go to the Taiwan question. I am strongly of the view that if our combined interest is to maintain the status quo in Taiwan so that the bobbling little democracy that's emerged there over the last 20 to 25 years, the brilliant economy, the open society, and everything that we admire about what's gone on in Taiwan and unfolded there. If our interest is to maintain the status quo, how is that best secured? And I'm therefore all for every bit of robust security policy and defence policy and military assistance that we can lend to Taiwan to enhance the deterrence equation. But I'm all for the substance of that, but I'm not for the symbols associated with other stuff, such as redesignation of the Taiwan office as the Taiwan Representative Office, or Taiwan as a non-NATO ally, for all the symbolic reasons which may make it attractive to members of the Congress, but which frankly run the grave risk of crossing all sorts of political perception red lines on the part of a Chinese leadership already increasingly pumped up by their analysis of what's unfolding around them. So I'm all for the maximum of substance being delivered as much as we can on a bipartisan basis through the United States Congress and in partnership with US allies around the world, not just Asia, but in Europe, rather than playing around with the symbols of this stuff, which often is what attracts politicians in the legislative process most, because it's easier to understand, easier to market, and easier to provoke a direct political reaction from Beijing. But Bonnie, I'd be interested in your take on that. Sorry to interrupt, Rorry, but it's your job to direct the traffic, not mine.
No, Bonnie, if you could you speak a little bit about how we get out of some of these security dilemma dynamics that I think Kevin was describing? So maybe it looks like a success from Xi Jinping's point of view, but certainly the way that the military and other punitive measures are being taken in the United States is going to prompt some sort of response. Is there any way out of this kind of cycle of action and reaction on Taiwan? And is there a role for communication? What is that role?
Well, I think that we have a potential window of opportunity, maybe after the 20th Party Congress, to try and introduce greater stability into the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship. That window probably will not be a very long one, though. Taiwan is going to be heading into their own presidential campaign. They will have elections in January 2023, and a new president installed the following May. And I think many of us believe that it is unlikely that Taiwan's next president will be from the KMT. It is more likely it will be somebody from the DPP and perhaps somebody from the deep green side of the spectrum. And whereas I believe, although of course the Chinese claim that Taiwan has been a destabilizing factor, I think most of us would agree that Taiwan has been more consistent in its policy. President Tsai Ing-wen has been generally prudent, and she has not been provocative. And so that could change. And so I think that there is a need to have a serious dialogue that perhaps restores the credibility of both sides' red lines. My recommendation, I have a feeling that Danny will cringe when I say this, but my recommendation has been that the United States should have a senior official give a speech on policy toward Taiwan. We all know that the Blinken speech on China policy, it took time. It was probably contentious in the administration, and probably nobody wants to start work on another speech. Of course, it could be given by our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. I would not advise that it be given by the president. But I believe that it is necessary for the United States to have a greater degree of consistency and clarity about what our one China policy is and is not. I think it has outlived its usefulness to describe our one China policy as the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 joint U.S.-China communiques and the 6 assurances. Very few people know what that means, and the American public certainly does not. So I think the United States needs to restore the credibility of our one China policy. Now, certainly China's pressure on Taiwan is growing, and so our one China policy has to be dynamic. But at the same time, it can be clear and more consistent. So I would like to see a speech that explains what our one China policy is, why Taiwan matters to the United States, and lays out sort of what we see as the as what we want from China. And perhaps after the 20th Party Congress, Xi Jinping would be in a position to take some moves that might stabilize the situation. He may look forward at the next elections in Taiwan and be quite nervous himself. And I'd like to see the United States more actively encourage cross-strait dialogue. This is something we used to do. It's not going to happen today or tomorrow, but I think it is important to restore dialogue between the two sides of the strait. There is so much misunderstanding, misperceptions, and even if there is no acceptance of somebody's definition of 1992 consensus, creative minds can come up with a way to find a common basis to have a conversation. So those are my thoughts.
Well, thanks for that, Bonnie. And I think with that, we have reached time on this webinar. So let's leave with Bonnie's call for more clarity, more communication, and hopefully a strategic window in which the U.S. can push for better cross-strait communication in the months ahead. Thank you all so much for joining us for this program. Thanks to the panelists for taking the time. This was an incredibly robust discussion on a topic I'm sure that we will plan more programs around in the future. Please visit us at asiasociety.org to find more work from the Asia Society Policy Institute, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.